Welcome to New York Law School. I'm Professor Lenny Benson. I teach here at the school. I teach a variety of courses: civil procedure, administrative law, immigration law, advanced immigration law, our Safe Passage Project Clinic. Here at New York Law School, we are very happy to also announce this year we have created an Asylum and Human Rights Clinic, and my colleague Claire Thomas, who's sitting in the front row, who's presenting later, is teaching that clinic. New York Law School has 5 different courses on various of immigration topics, and so in the room tonight are some of our students. Some of the students are coming from evening class, so they may be coming in a little bit later. We really appreciate so many of you in the public coming to this event tonight. Those of you who are doing CLE, you should have received, if you registered earlier than today, an email yesterday. I got it, and it said from New York Law School and Safe Passage Project, and it had a link to a Dropbox. But I know how people are with their email. So Danae, my research assistant, Danae, wave your hand back there in the back. She's in the very back. She is going to, tomorrow morning, re-email everyone who registered for the event. So if for some reason you didn't see that in your Dropbox, in your email yesterday, if you registered for this event, you should have received a link to the Dropbox. In that Dropbox, you will find copies of presentations you're seeing today, materials that I gathered that I thought were useful to beginners or intermediate level in appearing before the asylum office, some leading cases that are quite important, guidelines from the UNHCR, other materials we had from other CLEs that I thought would be useful to you in preparing to represent individuals before the asylum office. Today's program is 3 credits of continuing legal education. The first hour, which we're going to start in just a moment here, is general skills practice. The second hour is representatives from the asylum office, also general skills, and the third hour, professional practice on trauma-informed lawyering. I do want to note that beginning January 2018, everyone who is registering for CLE reaccreditation before the New York State Bar by July 1, will need to have 1 credit of anti-bias, anti-discrimination CLE. And I'm sure that that's something that Professor Thomas and I will find a way to offer in the context of immigration practice. And so watch your email for that. Once you've registered for an email, a CLE program for us, we have you in our master email list. We don't send out a lot of emails, but we'll send you a notice about upcoming events. The other thing I wanted to mention is this past summer, we did several other events. I see some of our regulars who came. On June 20th, we did Best Practices in Family Court representing immigrant youth. It was a 3-hour CLE, primarily focused on service of process in the family court, guardianship, and special immigrant juvenile status issues. We have a video recording of that, and soon you'll receive an email from us if you would like to order it on demand. We are now certified to give you CLE credit on a non-live event when you watch a video and put in the code words and get the credits. In June, celebrating World Refugee Day, we had a program that covered refugee issues, international law, the Refugee Convention, excuse me, current trends in refugee adjudication, preparing a case for immigration court. And our last hour, really a fantastic program. Our last hour was a lawyer from Canada talking about the third safe country agreement. And if you follow the newspapers, you know that many people are traveling through New York, crossing into the Canadian territory. If they present themselves at a port of entry, they may be turned back and end up in ICE detention. If they cross the border illicitly, they may have an opportunity to seek asylum. It's just that simple. But it's an hour-long, fantastic presentation. That CLE is also available on demand, and so when we send you that email that follows up, we'll let you know about that one as well. All right, so enough advertising. I want to do a quick thank yous to Claire Thomas, who helped plan this event, to Jennifer Barker, who did a lot of preparation for this event, to Jeff, who's our speaker in the last hour, fantastic speaker, I'm so excited, to Sunil from the Asylum Office for coming from New Jersey, to New York Law School staff and facilities, Errol, who's running our AV, Sandra, who runs our space, and to Danae Salvatera, who's my research assistant, who, with my secretary, Gia Gordon, has done all the paperwork, and there's a lot. All right, now a little bit more of substance introduction, and then I'm gonna turn the time over to Jennifer. In this first hour, Jennifer has a presentation, and then I have a few follow-up questions for her, and then we will be opening the floor to Q&A. There is blank paper available here. Claire has it. If you have a question you'd like to write down, that would be my preference, that you write down your question legibly, and I'll go through them and try to repeat them into the microphone. But you'll also see we have 2 live mics in the center of the aisles here. If you try to shout from your seat, the audio recording will not pick you up. And so we ask you to either put your question in writing or go to one of the mics, and we'll fit in as many as we can before the hour ends. That will be the same format for the following 2 hours. Okay, just really quick on substance. We're about to have a good conversation about best practices in preparing to appear before the Asylum Office. I'm holding up a book that came out a few years ago by Andrew Schoenholtz, Philip Schrag, and Jaya Ramji Nogales, who were given statistical data from the Asylum Office. They used the assistance of a statistician, and they evaluated claims, issues, adjudication patterns, and outcomes before the Asylum Office. It was unprecedented access to a tremendous amount of empirical data from the Asylum Office itself. Their previous book you may have heard of, called Refugee Roulette. This book is called Lives in the Balance. One of the notes that they put into this book, and there's many good practice tips. I mean, you can probably borrow this book from a library, or I do believe it's worth your investment. To asylum officers, lack of credibility is the most important reason why asylum is not granted. 84% of the asylum officers stating this is very often or often the reason for not granting asylum. 27% said legal ineligibility, and 14% said in a case where corroboration was available, lack of corroboration was a problem. But let's go back to the 84% of asylum officers saying your client was not credible. Because you're here in the room and you are advocates representing individuals, we are responsible as the advocates helping to prepare these individuals for the Asylum Office in having our clients present as clear a narrative and as well prepared a narrative as possible. There are some attorneys who work with their clients, prepare the I-589, and their preference is to prepare a very minimal I-589, put it into the Asylum Office, and then they do not go to the Asylum Office with their client. In my view, that is not the best practice. There is a real opportunity to be successful before the Asylum Office, and of course, being represented is already a huge advantage. But this finding that the asylum officers may be summarized as lack of credibility as the main reason may in part be that your client was extremely nervous, was terrified, and you were not at their side. For those of you who've had that experience and you were there and you were well prepared, and unfortunately the asylum officer still found that your client had not presented a credible claim, well, we can't win every case at that venue, which is why we're so fortunate to have de novo review before the immigration court. Many countries in the world do not offer this opportunity. But tonight's program is focused on making the most of that first opportunity. Our first speaker tonight is an expert. Jennifer Barker is a senior staff attorney at the New York Legal Assistance Group, nicknamed NYLAG. Before she joined NAGLAG, she, for many years, worked with the Asylum Office in the Lyndhurst or New Jersey office. So she's been on both sides of the fence. I was so excited to pick her brain to prepare for this program tonight. And so, Jennifer, the show is now yours.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great. So I'm Jennifer Barker. I'm a supervising attorney at New York Legal Assistance Group. I supervise staff attorneys and pro bonos, and I also represent children and adults in removal seeking asylum. And the first thing I wanted to talk about a little bit. Closer? Okay.
He's gonna raise the volume as well.
How's that? Is that good? Okay. So the first thing I want people to think about is what a child's interview or a child's asylum process looked like prior to 2008. Children in removal prior to 2008 were treated as adults in the same way that they had to go through the same process that adult would in seeking asylum before the immigration court and face an immigration judge in an adversarial interview. And then we have the passage of the TVPRA in 2008, which is like a background to my presentation, because the TVPRA gave initial jurisdiction to the Asylum Office for unaccompanied alien children. And this is really key and important because prior to 2008, end of 2008 and 2009, unaccompanied alien children were treated almost as adults in removal proceedings, and it made their representation of these children very difficult. Okay, so we want to take advantage of the fact that we can now go to the asylum office and have an interview before a trained asylum officer, a person who's been trained in asylum law specifically, and somebody who's been trained in interviewing. And we're going to go through some of the background of how to prepare for this interview. And like Lenny said, you want to take advantage of the fact that we can have this asylum interview and not wait until your client is referred to court, and then you have to fight their case in court in an adversarial setting. So this is an overview of how an asylum officer is trained. There's actually an asylum and refugee corps. It's combined now, so all refugee officers who are doing training or interviews overseas are trained with the same training as asylum officers who are interviewing people inside the United States seeking asylum. There's a 7-week training that all officers go to in the very beginning, and it's pretty intense. It's a residential training where you're off-site and you're there 7 weeks straight. Then after that initial training, there's another 7-week training later on regular immigration law. Officers are trained on non-adversarial interviewing techniques. They are trained on how to elicit testimony and to develop a story or develop the narrative. They're also trained on how to interview children. So how can you prepare yourself for this interview? If this is the first time, and in a lot of cases, pro bonos will take one case, and this is the first time they're ever going to the asylum office, you need to speak to other attorneys who are seasoned immigration practitioners and get an idea of what this interview is going to look like and how you should prepare yourself. There's local asylum office policies that are different. For example, the New York Asylum Office has very different policies on submission of evidence compared to Newark. You need to know those differences. and I'm going to go over those in just one moment. Again, bring extra copies of any evidence or filings that you're going to mail or submit after your initial filing, just in case those were lost prior to interview and you need to hand in extra evidence. And also, you need to know your case better than anyone else. There should not be a question that an asylum officer is going to ask that you don't know the answer to. This is your client. You need to spend time with them. You need to talk to them, and you need to know their story. You need to know their life. Again, other tips: practice questions with your client. Representing children in particular, representing anyone who's seeking asylum, and representing children in particular, is a time-consuming task. It's not something that's going to be a quick pro bono experience. It's going to take time. It's going to take patience. It's going to take appointments where your client doesn't show up because they're sick or something happened to them. This takes patience, and you need to really dedicate yourself to sitting with your client and speaking to them and getting to know their story. These are the submission policies of the two different offices for evidence. These are just some tips that want people to keep in mind. Each office is different. New York City is divided into two jurisdictions, making it a little complicated. But Newark takes all residents of Manhattan and the Bronx, and New York takes Staten Island, Queens, and Brooklyn. So you have to know the two differences between these two offices, because the New York Asylum Office will take all evidence on the day of the interview, but if you show up to Newark with a client from the Bronx or Manhattan with a large submission on the day of, they're going to reschedule you. You need to send all your evidence to the New York Asylum Office at least a week ahead of time. Okay, so back to the bigger issue of how do you prepare your client for this interview. And I'm going to run through a series of questions that I keep in mind with my clients. And you always want to keep in mind who you're talking to and making sure that your language and the level of explanation is appropriate for the person you're speaking to. So you're talking to a young child, you're going to have to tell them that they're going to an interview with an immigration officer and it can take 3 hours. This is not something that a kid who's 8 years old or 10 years old is going to want to do. They don't want to miss school generally. They don't want to head out to an immigration office and sit in the waiting room for 3 hours. These are, and they especially do not want to sit and talk about bad things that happen to them. So these are topics that you need to discuss with your client each time you meet them, or more than just the last time you're meeting with them, but you also have to do it in a way that is not going to discourage your client from coming back to see you, because it's possible that you may scare them too much the first time and then you never talk to them again. So we want to explain to our client who's going to be at this asylum interview. We know that our clients will be there, our client. There's an asylum officer, an interpreter monitor on the phone, the attorney, yourself, and then the parent or guardian or trusted adult if the child wants that person in the room. So what I usually do is I explain who's going to sit where in the interview room and who's allowed to come in, and I explain the role of each of these people. So in the case of a young child who's going to want to have a parent there, I usually explain that your parent and you are going to be sitting there. We're going to bring this interpreter who speaks English and Spanish, who you've already met before, hopefully. And then there'll be somebody listening on the phone to the English and Spanish and making sure that it's accurately interpreted. That's the interpreter monitor that the asylum officer will call during the interview. And then there'll be an asylum officer, and that's it. And so you want to put your client at ease by explaining the setup in the room. So most of my clients, especially younger children, will want to know what's going to be asked. What do they have to talk about? What kind of questions are going to be asked? And you want to practice and conduct a mock interview with your client. Don't make it stressful. Even if there's a chance that your client will have a stressful interview, I don't think it's a good idea to make the mock interview stressful or adversarial. Take breaks. Don't coach your client. Just ask them to answer the questions truthfully. But you can also point out to your client what in particular you liked about the testimony that they gave to you, and explain to them why that particular part of the testimony is important to tell on the day of the interview. And this is not coaching your client, but it's also letting them understand what part of the story makes them eligible for asylum. And I think that's important that people understand. Okay, and then as an attorney, you're going to have obviously all the events listed, and be ready to make sure that you either go through your affidavit as the interview is progressing and tick off. I usually tick off the events that I want to make sure that came out, or have a list and tick them off during the interview to make sure that they came out. Because at the end of the interview, most asylum officers will give you a chance to ask extra questions. So if any of those major events that you want to be testified to did not come out, then you're going to elicit that testimony at the end with a few questions from your client. Okay, and then I usually tell my younger clients that if I'm going to definitely ask you about X, Y, and Z. So if you don't happen to say that, expect me to ask about it at the end of the interview, so that they're prepared to talk about certain issues. Very important. Please don't tell your client to Google the address of the asylum office and meet you there, because they're probably not going to be there. They're going to call you from the Port Authority and ask you which bus they need to take, and it'll be half an hour late already. Okay, so please map this out for people. I usually have my interpreter most of my interpreters live in the city, so I have them meet them at the bus station and bring them on the bus. I mean, if I was in a foreign country trying to get to a government office, I probably wouldn't make it on time either at 7 in the morning, 8 in the morning, okay? So keep that in mind. Map this out for people and get them there on time. This should be really clear ahead of time. You're meeting with your client right ahead of the interview. You're going through what documents they're going to bring. You're telling them what documents you're bringing, so that at the interview you're not scrambling and saying, oh, I told you to bring it. No, you said you would bring it, okay? Everyone should know what they need to bring. Clients have their original documents. Make sure they're bringing them, or you bring them for them, okay? Witnesses is an interesting question because the asylum office doesn't normally take witness testimony. And you can asked to have witnesses testify, it's not likely that they'll have time to interview witnesses. But if it's a child and you want the parent to testify because the child's too young maybe to testify in detail to something, or the parent knows really important information that the child doesn't know, then you want to bring your witnesses and tell the officer ahead of time that you have this witness available. And please submit affidavits as well, just in case the officer doesn't allow your witness to testify. Few common problems that happen at interviews frequently. This happens frequently. You think that your client is prepared. You've practiced numerous times in your office. Your client hasn't had problems telling the story. They get in front of the officer and they can't talk, and they're frozen. It's very frustrating, but it's actually normal and pretty frequent. As a young attorney, I used to try to kick my client's chair. I no longer recommend that. And it's actually pretty normal for children. If you think about children, it's pretty normal for them not to talk freely in front of people they don't know. And so I've found as an asylum officer and an attorney that children will warm up as time goes on. So give them a little time to feel comfortable. And the asylum officers are trained in starting these interviews with ice-breaking type questions where they're not jumping into past harm, but they're asking things about like school and where they live and hobbies and that type of thing. So if you have a good officer, hopefully the child will warm up and begin to talk. Obviously, that isn't always the case, and we have adult and child clients that have suffered severe past trauma, they have PTSD. I think it's important to remind the officer of this and to point out the evidence of the PTSD. Just because the officers are doing numerous interviews, and they may not have it fresh in their mind or right present in their mind that the person who's not talking or is acting reluctant to answer questions is suffering PTSD. So I would have that ready to point out right away. And then, of course, at the end, you'll point that out to the officer in your closing. The wrong answer. I call this the wrong answer because my clients tend to ask me, like, what happens if I give them the wrong answer? There's no wrong answer. Okay, you're telling the truth. Maybe it's not going to come out of your mouth the way you wanted it to come out, but just continue. This is what I tell my clients. Just continue to talk, because no matter how much you practice or think about how you're going to present your story, it's not going to come out exactly in the way that you planned. So I try to tell people to keep calm and just keep talking. Again, all my clients think that they need to know the exact dates that things happen. This isn't true. You don't need to know exact dates. I can't give you exact dates of a lot of things in my own personal life, so people should not have to give exact dates. You can help your clients remember when things happened approximately by asking if they know the year or the season, or maybe how old their children were when something happened, and then this sticks in their mind better and they're able to recall it when they're asked about it. This frequently happens where a client who's suffering severe trauma just completely breaks down, is crying, and cannot continue on. Asylum officers are used to this. This happens very frequently. So I would just ask for a break from the asylum officer. Let your client take a little break, get a drink of water, and then come back to the interview. Okay, this is, in my opinion, the most important thing to prepare your client for their interviewing. Many people who don't have higher education, especially children, people who haven't been through formal schooling, don't speak with the same level of specificity that many of us attorneys speak with. And you need to prepare your client to try to be specific about what happened to them. And a couple of the ways that I get them to do this is by adding context to answers they're giving me. So when I get an answer about something, I ask a question of my client and I get an answer, I do many follow-up questions to get the context, and then I tell the client, I think that what you're telling me is important information that should also be told during your asylum interview. Okay, so you get the context to come out, okay? This is especially important with descriptions of things that are different in their country than here. And I'm gonna give you an example. Police. People, you'll get an officer will ask, well, did you report this assault to the police? Okay, where does your client live? These are the questions you're gonna ask. Where does your client live? Are there police in the town where they live? Where is the nearest police station? Is it a 5-minute drive or a 3-hour walk? These are all very, very important details that you want to get out of your client, because if the officer says, oh, why didn't you report that to the police? And the answer from your client is, the police don't do anything to help anyone. And then the real answer expanded that you know is that the police don't do anything to help anyone because the nearest police station is a 3-hour walk and there's no cars that enter the village, and the only authority in the village is somebody related to your client. It's a totally different context, and the details make a difference in how the officer will understand the story. Okay. And I put this one in at the risk of Sunil being annoyed by it. But he knows what I'm talking about. So there are, as an ex-asylum officer, there's occasions where you're dealing with multiple affidavits. And so you may have an affidavit of the client, you have a long affidavit from a family member, and then you have a brief. So you have like 3 sets of facts that you're looking at, and then you have a client testifying before you, and you're looking at all the 3 stories and the person testifying before you, and sometimes you mess up. And you think, oh, this event, they just said that this event occurred on March 3rd, when really they actually didn't say that, and the affidavits are all consistent. It happens. If you definitely think the asylum officer is confused and you can say one short phrase to put them back to where they need to go ahead and do it, okay? If it's gonna be a long argument, it's probably not worth it, because you're just gonna have to follow up at the end, and there may be some kind of credibility issue that they're going at. But if you think you can point people back into the right direction, it's a good idea. Okay, this speaks for itself, I think. I really, there are asylum officers that will differ on this, but there are many ways to get, as an officer, there are many ways to get somebody's story without asking them explicit questions about a sexual act or a rape. Okay, so maybe Sunil can add something about this, but I don't think that if you're being asked very, very explicit questions about a sexual act or something that's very inappropriate and it's obviously causing your client, to become very upset, I don't think it's necessary, and I think that you can ask the officer to question about something else or move on to a different event. Okay, and my last comment here is about an issue that's been coming up recently with questions about child smuggling. Since we're talking about unaccompanied alien children, many of them are coming to the United States. They have maybe one parent living in New York who they're released to from ORR. And there's been instances where children have been asked very specific questions about who paid for their trip, who smuggled them, how was the money sent, how much money was sent, and in our view, in my view especially, these are not relevant questions to an asylum claim. They're only relevant if there seems to be an issue of safety of the child right now in New York, or a past trafficking incident of the child on the way to the United States. So one of the ways I think to deal with these questions that may come up at the asylum office is to have a packet of information ready for the asylum officer showing that your child's registered and your client's registered in school, your client lives in a safe home. These are the identification documents of the people that your client lives with. This is how they're related to your client. So that questions of current safety and trafficking are not a worry to the asylum officer. Okay, Lenny. And we have questions?
So we're up to me now. Okay. So Jennifer, I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Do you feel comfortable standing, or would you like to come sit down?
I can stand.
Okay. So Jennifer and I prepared the presentation. We spent a little bit of time talking, and as she was presenting, I was just noting some of the questions that we might just go a little bit deeper. So this last point that you were making, this is a current issue, and I know Sunil representing the New Jersey office may explain some of this to us. But one of the things that I was saying is that an approach I might use, and maybe Jennifer, you want to comment, is if I thought there was going to be a line of questioning about how did you come, who paid for your trip, I might affirmatively interrupt and say, particularly if I have a juvenile client, I want to assure the officer that I have made a thorough investigation. I evaluated whether my client had been trafficked to the United States. If I thought he or she had been, I would be applying for a T visa, or I am also applying for a T visa, if that's your situation. Going ahead, showing that you've made that inquiry. What do you think about interrupting for the lawyer to offer that assurance that they've done that factual background?
I think it's appropriate, but I also think it's really important that you do know where your client lives and who they live with.
So you don't want to be willfully blind.
Yeah, to not be willfully blind, because and I think as as individuals or advocates in the legal services community and law school clinics, we do a good job of that. The private bar does not always do a good job of that, in my experience. So I really encourage you to know where your client lives and to make sure that things are okay where they are, so that when you present this information to the asylum office, you are very sure that there's not a current trafficking issue or a safety issue. And
we talked about, for example, if someone's attending school regularly, at least in immigration court, that's usually a good attendance record, is an indication that the young person's in a safe environment and there's other adults who are able to assess their situation. And so if you have, one of those perfect attendance kids, that might be a good thing to add into the file. Another point you made was if the questions become too explicit or stressful or repetitive, that they're re-traumatizing the client, and our third panel may also address some of this. You suggested that you could suggest to the asylum officer you can move on. When is it appropriate, for example, to actually make a note of it and to request a supervisor? Should you do that during the interview, at the conclusion of the interview? What would you recommend? For example, if you thought an officer was perhaps demonstrating some gender bias or really being hostile to your client and not listening to the client responding.
I would do it in the middle of the interview.
So I agree with you. We didn't really practice that question, but we think that if an officer is going beyond the scope of professionalism and being harassing, really, or fiercely interrogating your client, that it is appropriate to say, excuse me, I'd like to stop the interview. I'd like to speak to your supervisor. There is in the gender guidelines and in the child guidelines, it's supposed to be appropriate interviewing techniques for the young person or the gender victim. Could be any gender, so it's appropriate to ask for that supervisor. I had another question for you just to clarify some of the points that you already made. You talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And I know you were here when my class had a mock trial, and we heard two immigration judges say to us, well, at least one of them said, PTSD becomes as frequently said as well-founded fear. So what are some ways that you can reawake the sensitivity in the officer to the situation? What kind of evidence do you think is recommended, if you can secure it, to bring with your client rather than just pointing out that they might be a victim of post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, I don't think it's helpful to point out that somebody might be a victim. I think you need a diagnosis, and you need a evaluation from a mental health practitioner, preferably a psychologist or psychiatrist. We're in New York City. There's lots of resources for that. I practiced in Miami. It's a whole different world here. You can get a mental health evaluation in New York for your client, and you need to try to do it. It makes a huge difference, and it's a piece of evidence that you can point out and you can pull out in the middle of the interview and hand it to the officer.
So an ideal would be a one-on-one assessment by a licensed health professional. That could be a psychiatric social worker, a physician, a pediatrician, a psychologist. A bad example would be someone in the family saying, well, I think they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. You, just like, even though it's not the formal rules of evidence, you do want to qualify the person who's making that assessment. This is something that quite often pro bono lawyers will wait to the last minute, and many of the organizations in New York are available, but they have a 6-week backlog, so you need to think in advance and plan in advance to try to get an appointment with someone who's skilled in that area. I do think there's an awful lot of physicians and psychiatric social workers and others who will offer those assessments. So here's a question, maybe it's the follow-up of one I already gave from the audience. And by the way, audience, if I don't ask your question in this hour, it's because I'm anticipating it'll be covered in the next hour. What about if you are antagonizing the asylum officer with your interventions? I mean, when is intervening to help perfect the interview too much? What are some tips you might recommend so that you don't overdo it?
I mean, it's a judgment call. I mean, I had a 10-year-old who was interviewed for 3.5 hours. I personally thought the interview was excessive, but I was pretty certain that my client was okay and that I was going to get a grant, so I let it go. But if those 3.5 hours went on, and I didn't think my client was doing well and was going to be a basket case at the end of the 3.5 hours, or it was getting very adversarial, or I was going to not get a grant at the end, then this is just me. Then I would interrupt, and I would ask to speak to a supervisor, or say, like, I think the questioning has been long and excessive. I think we covered these points.
I mean, one of the things Jennifer pointed out is you do have to go very early in the morning. In Bethpage, I believe the start time is 7:45, and you should really be there earlier. And we'll hear about Lyndhurst in a moment. But a young person may have gotten up at 4 in the morning, or your client may have gotten up at 4 in the morning using public transportation to get to that office. So giving your client some good advice about being rested, having some food, and then if you have a vulnerable client, asking that officer for a break.
Yeah.
I think this is a great question, though. How do we not antagonize by raising our objections? Maybe we want to practice with our friends, colleagues, and loved ones and say, would you be really offended if I said it this way? And in other words, not in the moment of the emotion in the room, losing our cool or losing our professionalism. So maybe also empathizing a little bit with the officer and saying something like, Officer Jones, as you saw in my submission, I tried to organize for you a timeline of events, and perhaps we could take a look at that again, and this might help clarify this line of questioning. Just very politely offering to be of assistance. If you think of asylum officers as people, and I'm sure they are, and if you realize the pressure they're going to feel when the interview's over to produce the written work they have to produce, which I hope Sunil will talk about in the next hour, you can anticipate how you can help them do their job well.
Yeah.
And so, there's a phrase in marriage counseling, don't use you phrases, like you are not asking this well, or you're hurting my client, or you're not listening to the client. Instead, you try to come up with a different phrase, like saying, perhaps it could be helpful if I had the client rephrase that, re-answer that question, because I don't think he got an opportunity to say everything he was planning, maybe because the officer interrupted. But if you say, you interrupted my client, and now he doesn't get to say it, the officer's going to naturally get defensive. So if you say, perhaps my client could be allowed to complete the statement, is much less a direct in your face. So practice those marriage counseling tips, no use statements. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And they may tell you to be quiet and you can't talk until the end. I mean, that may happen.
So that's the part I was going to ask you about the end. So we had talked a little bit about the value of offering to do a brief summation, and also the value of preparing written legal briefs with your asylum application, or I think we call it a letter brief. In other words, it's not a 50-page submission, but it just laying out a roadmap of the prima facie elements and how your client's facts prove the law, maybe like a law school exam. So do you want to talk about offering written submission and also the summation at the end?
Yeah, depending on the issues in the case. Look, some people like to write a full brief, that's fine. Some people like to do a very long cover letter that lays out the issues, like a memo. As an asylum officer, I found that to be more helpful than a longer brief. And I think it depends on the particular case and the issues in the case. I definitely encourage everyone to give a closing summation at the end, outlining your client's testimony, outlining eligibility, and follow-up questions before that summation. If there's any testimony that didn't come out, ask the officer if you can ask your client a couple questions and get that testimony on the record.
So 2 weeks or 3 weeks after you've had your interview, your client will be asked to come back to pick up their decision in most cases. Sometimes it's longer. If the case has been denied, and sometimes the denials are they're always very brief, right? Your case has been referred to the immigration court, you did not establish the nexus or some statement like that. How often would you suggest in a situation like that you make a formal request to reconsider, and what would trigger that request? That was one of the questions from the audience. Is there something that would have happened during the interview that you would say, rather than wait for the immigration court de novo review, starting it all from fresh, I want to ask the asylum office to reconsider?
Do you want to answer that question, Claire? Because I hardly ever...
You hardly ever do.
I hardly ever do that.
I mean, I'm going to answer it, and Claire, you could supplement maybe. I would say that if something happened during the interview where you thought the officer was not addressing some of the evidence you'd submitted and just didn't ask any questions about it, didn't give you an opportunity to elaborate, and then you see in this bare bones denial, you think that was the missing link, then maybe it is to say, I took notes during the interview, I tried to rehabilitate, I don't think the officer addressed this evidence. But let's see what Professor Thomas thinks.
I agree with Professor Benson. Usually, the times that I've had an issue is the only time that I've done such a thing in terms of request to reconsider. But I think we will let the expert, hi Sunil,
In the
talk
second
about
hour.
that in the second hour, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
And then just on what's the value of doing that, if there was a problematic officer, that would, of course, put management on alert that that officer was a problem. It would have been good if you did that contemporaneously,
Yeah,
rather than waiting for the denial.
Yeah, and at the asylum office at USCIS at 26 Federal Plaza, when there's a problem interview, I talk about it the same day. I don't let it go. I ask for a supervisor the same day.
And of course, you can always do that very respectfully.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple other questions that we had for the audience. I'm just going to take one more that I know we'll do some more in the second hour. This was, there have been situations where young people are released by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And for those of you who are new, unaccompanied children are taken into custody by Department of Homeland Security. By statute and by case law, they are required within 72 hours to be turned over to a more appropriate setting. And we didn't have a federal agency that was prepared to be the custodian of unaccompanied children. So the custodial agency is the same agency, Office of Refugee Resettlement, that does do some of the work from bringing refugees from abroad, vetted by our government and admitted to the United States. So it's a complete misnomer of a name for this context, but ORR, as you'll hear us call it, is now staffed to have, they have over 10,000 beds. Here in New York State, there's over 1,000 children in detention. The ORR officials vet adults, whether they're a parent, an aunt, a friend of the family, a stranger, but who's motivated to assist, to determine are they appropriate placement. And in the last few years, because of some problems and because of congressional pressure and because of just best practices, there's been a little bit more robust following up with, is this an appropriate placement? So the question was, what if the child was released by RR to number one sponsor, but later the child has changed homes? Should we address the fact that they changed the home in the asylum office? And my answer is yes, you should be prepared to address that. In the sponsor agreement, it does say the sponsor is obligated to notify ORR when they are no longer caring for the child. Sometimes that is in the child's best interests. The child is moved to a home where they're closer to school, or there's more resources, or the adult to whom they were released was not an appropriate person. Sometimes the young person has matured and they have they believe themselves to be mature and they don't want to live with a sponsor who is very controlling and they want to emancipate themselves. That can be dangerous, or it can be a positive situation. If you're representing the young person, I think you want to be prepared at the asylum office to explain that they are now living in a safe environment. But did you have anything
No,
else
I agree.
about
I
that?
agree with that.
Did you have anything else clear on that?
Good.
Okay, so it is an issue of concern for the asylum office, and I think we're going to hear that in the second hour. So if we have about 4 more minutes, if people will indulge me, I wrote another question down. We talked about offering affidavits with an asylum interview. Some people worry about giving affidavits because they're worried about hearsay and the witness is not available to testify, or maybe the affidavit's coming from overseas. What is your experience and what kind of evidence is admissible to the asylum office?
So any relevant evidence, and then, depending on the reliability of that evidence, different weight will be applied.
So in
Obviously,
other words, if
so-
it's an out-of-court, out-of-asylum office statement and that person's not available or it's not notarized, it may have a little less weight.
Exactly.
But it doesn't mean you shouldn't submit it.
If it's relevant, I would submit it.
And translate it into English with
Yeah,
the
and
proper
translate it into
translation.
English.
Is that something for new lawyers or people who are unused to this field? They think they have to have professional paid translations. If you have the resources to do that, that's great. But in immigration practice, it's usually just someone certifying they are conversant and fluent in the language in which they're translating it, and they sign, and then their signature. I think it would be a good idea to have their signature notarized.
Correct.
Okay, so do you have a concern if you can't give any affidavits? So particularly, there just isn't any corroboration. Do you have a concern about that in an asylum case?
I mean, the more evidence you have, the better. The more documentary evidence that you have, the better, the stronger it makes your case. More detailed affidavits, the better
So we
the
were
case.
talking,
But there's no reason that if you have a very good claim, there's no reason not to file it, in my opinion, if all you have is your client's testimony.
and in fact, that's in the regulations, that corroboration is not required. But if corroboration is available and you don't get it, that could be harmful. So for example, if your client is saying, I was expelled from school for my political activity, and if that school has written records and you don't try to get those records, I think you're missing an opportunity. If you try to get the records and they're impossible to get because of a privacy law or because there's a high fee, then document that
Document
and say
it.
that's why we couldn't get that corroboration. We also talked about using expert testimony. So for example, where maybe a situation, particularly with a younger client, they can't really testify about the country conditions. That's for the lawyer to try to find context and information from other sources. So we know that at the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, they've recently been working with American University's Central American Project to train experts to be more helpful in asylum and refugee cases. And there are, perhaps if you're a subscriber to Immigration Briefings, which is in the Bender's Digest, you know that some well-known experts have issued some uniform or universal or generic affidavits. So certainly a generic affidavit is useful to submit into a case, and they're not charging you to use these. But if you can recruit an expert to testify to your client's specific situation, that's going to be more ideal. So I gave an example when we were preparing of an African country where the client is saying, I knew that the people who came to my home were the government, and they were going to take my uncle and they were going to interrogate him. And the question was, how did you know that was the government people? Were they wearing uniforms? No. Did they show ID badges? No. Well, how did you know those were the government and took your uncle and not colleagues or friends or guerrilla movement? And they said, oh, because they were in the black cars. And the first pass of that interview just kind of went by. And then later, my colleague came back and said, well, why did the black car tell you that was the government? Oh, because they're Mercedes. And in my country, the only people who have these black cars, it's a fleet the government imports. Or the license plate was a government-issued license plate. So by you following up and asking that question, your client may not be able to testify personally to all that, but then you might be able to find an expert about the country conditions that would help corroborate your client's statement that indeed the government of X country does import a fleet of black Mercedes for their government officials. All right, well, we are done with time. So we're going to
All right, everybody, thank you for staying with us. We're going to go ahead and get started so that you can all leave on time, because I know spending 3 hours with us is going to be enough. So my name is Claire Thomas. I am a professor here at New York Law School. I direct our brand new asylum clinic, and I see some of my students here, so thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much to Lenny Benson for organizing this tremendous event, and to all of our speakers. This has hopefully been a great evening for all of you in the audience as well. And I'd like to present my colleague Jeff Kagan-Trenchard, who will briefly introduce himself, and we will get the show on the road.
Hi. Thank you all very much for sticking around for the full program. My name is Jeff Kagan-Trenchard. I'm an attorney in private practice now. I do a lot of work with the New Sanctuary Coalition, and prior to private practice, I did a lot of public interest work, especially around representing young people in foster care, a lot of domestic violence divorces, and LGBTQ and other forms of asylum.
Great, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. If you can't hear us, anything like that, please wave your hands around. We wanna make sure that we are clear for you and of course for the recording.
If they have questions, you should bring them to me and I will read through them.
Great, so that's Professor Benson in the front row. She is happy to distribute your questions to us up here, so please ask us questions.
So our plan for tonight was to go over just some best practices in interviewing clients who've experienced trauma. here are some big overarching ideas, then we're gonna get into some sort of specific techniques, and then we may even do some hilarious role-playing. Well, you will see my totally junior level acting on full display. So overarching ideas that we'll kind of come back to over and over again throughout this presentation. So trauma impairs cognitive function. When you've been traumatized, it literally makes it more difficult to think. And not just think, but interact. And not just interact, but physically move through the world. The experience of trauma can interfere with proprioception. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you've been so upset that you start bumping into doors. Another friend that I facilitate with often, we call it trauma drunk, right? Where like you're so upset that you're unable to move, like they used to call it shell shocked before we had all this wonderful DSM. So when helping someone prepare a case that has all of the very, very important details and all of those important things that bring about credibility, keep in mind that those experiences that you are trying to get at are actively fighting the ability for the person to bring them up. Second thing, you're creating an experience for someone, and that experience is inexorably tied into what has also happened to them. So when you're coming in as the attorney representing someone who's been through hell, and your job is to help get them to some place a little bit better, you're part of that larger narrative. So brings to the next point, which is a quote by Flannery O'Connor. It's an amazing writer that you should be checking out. All action illuminates meaning. She has this lecture at the Iowa Writers Conference where she talks about how a complete story is one in which all action illuminates meaning. So everything going on in a story should point to the story's larger experience, what you're trying to get out of it. I think that applies sort of in reverse in real life. So everything you do to your client communicates something to your client. It's not just the words you say, it's how you say them. It's how often you say them. It's the experience that you create for them when they come into your office, when they see you, when they meet you. The tone of the email, the sound of your voice on the phone. It's not just these raw factual data points. It's the total culmination of what's going on. And you can tell someone over and over again, be calm. Just be calm. I said be calm. Like that doesn't create a calming experience, right? So, all right.
So Jeff in a second is going to define trauma for us, but before he does that, I just wanted to get into this idea of trauma-informed lawyering and why this is important, right? You're staying here because of the cookies, the coffee, the CLE credits, why ever you're here, but we do want a bigger takeaway, which is the idea that you can have a trauma-informed practice. And this means you're putting your client's trauma experience at the forefront of engaging with your client. And as such, you're going to need to adjust your litigation strategy, adjust how you interact with that client, and also practice self-care to counterbalance the effect of your client's trauma experience on you. The results of that will lead to a much better lawyering relationship between you and your clients, and hopefully an ability of your clients to trust you, to grow, and to share their information, which could lead to successful outcomes as well. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it to you to talk us through what trauma is.
So it was on the previous slide as well. There's a great article in Wired, which should be up in the Dropbox, which really sums up a lot of this really efficiently. But your brain doesn't hold memories. Your brain is literally made of memories. I don't know if anyone else here has small children and watches as many Pixar movies as I do on repeat as often as I do. But Inside Out is actually a pretty adorable little movie about feelings and emotions and the way that moves through the brain. But one of the big errors in it, factually, is that there's no memory that you have that's ever not actually recorded. It's all there. It all exists somewhere in all of these amazing little catacombs. Bessel van der Kolk, whose name I've never heard out loud, so I probably am not pronouncing it correctly, is an amazing psychologist who has all sort of just Google his name and read all of the things he has to say about trauma. The big takeaway from this quote is that trauma is the residue that a past event leaves in your own sensory experiences in your body. The past is not the past. It's a living experience. When someone is describing some horrible event that has happened to them on a physiological level, they are reliving the event. So bear that in mind when you're asking people to go over these details, and bear that in mind when you're asking them to get ready to present that information.
Great.
This is a slightly more poetic way of saying this. Don Lundy Martin is an amazing poet you should also Google. And this is just a line from one of her poems. Language feels too bulky to speak to trauma. What happens when we open our mouths to speak it? Out comes dust, blathering, a cry, a stammer, a circling, a return again and again to try and say what happened. And who among us has not had that experience, right? Even if you don't understand your experience as one of being particularly traumatic. But have you ever tried to explain to someone why the relationship went south and you just can't make your mouth do the word thing, right? So all that and more so, that's the way all of our brains and all of our bodies work.
All right. Ready to set the stage?
Setting the stage. So first we're going to go over a lot of sort of like pre-game things, if you will, things that you can do to prepare yourself and prepare the room and prepare the client for conducting these interviews. All right. So before the interview begins, always consider the room. Think about where the physical space, where this experience is taking place.
And this
right?
is especially for those of you who are in private practice or those of you who are taking pro bono cases and working at a law firm, right? For those of my nonprofit friends, you might not have a lot of control over which space you're using because you're with a scrappy organization and there's only one room and you fought your colleagues for it and that's the damn room you're using. But for those of you who have choices about where you're going to see your colleagues, this is or your clients, I'm sorry, this becomes particularly important.
Absolutely. So how is the room set up? Where is the door?
And why is that important, Jeff?
Well, if you've ever been trapped, you'd want to know how to get out of the situation.
Right.
You'd want to not have someone in a place of authority like you are as an attorney be physically blocking someone's ability to exit. And even if they're not consciously thinking that they're going to need to run out at any given moment, it creates a larger climate that says that, no, you're free to be here. You're allowed to be here. I would like you to be here. And you can leave at any time. I am not going to stop you.
So this is particularly significant for survivors of torture, survivors of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, incest, all of those horrors, the ability to be by the door. And what I do is let my clients choose where they're going to sit, right? It's your office, you're gonna be comfortable wherever, or you're just gonna suck it up for the next couple hours. Let your client choose his or her seat, right? That would be hopefully the best way where that person would feel comfortable.
Absolutely. Next, do you have tissues? I know it seems strange, but you know, these things often get emotional, and you always have supplies, always have things on hand. I carry around in my bag a little small packet of tissues for just such occasion. Also, water. If you're interviewing somewhere that you don't have total control over, you know, $1 water will go an awful long way just to have one, be able to hand to someone. Gum and mints. So a common sort of like secondary effect from having a traumatic episode or like a really intense feeling is the sensation of a really dry mouth or like a really, really bitter mouth. Sometimes people describe it as like copper or like blood. It has to do with elevated cortisol and adrenaline levels. But you can help someone calm down sometimes by taking the taste out of their mouth, because then it reminds the whole system that it can sort of go off of heightened response mode.
Okay. For my friends working in large law firms, oftentimes your bathrooms are not quite visible. They're not quite clear. I've been in a law firm where all the doors were white, right? Nothing said women, men, anybody, whatever. There was no way to find the bathroom. I had to ask for the bathroom. I'm comfortable doing that. But I don't expect a 10-year-old girl to be able to ask her 40-year-old male attorney where the bathroom is. Right? We don't want to put our clients in that situation. Tell people where the restroom is. Tell them that, of course, we can take breaks anytime you need to use the restroom, to get a drink of water, have the tissues out there, let them be visible, right? Make this whole situation as comfortable as it can be.
Exactly. And one thing that I try and even bring with me if necessary, is there a visible clock? So time can feel incredibly elastic, especially if you're talking about something incredibly upsetting. Personally, time is always elastic to me. We could have been in here all day and I'd have no idea. But not knowing what time it is and how long things are going is incredibly disorienting, which is why if you've ever gone to a casino, you'll never see a clock.
Ding, ding, ding.
It's intentionally, the architecture is intentionally constructed to do that. So letting people know, like making sure there's a clock visible, and then we'll get into in subsequent slides, making sure your client's aware of the time, how much time this situation is going to take, and then the steps following is a great way to sort of lower the stress on your client.
And we're going to talk a little bit later about the idea of working with interpreters, which for a lot of us, we're working with interpreters, or we will be at some point, and the idea of making sure that interpreter is a good fit for our clients. But I just wanted to throw that out there. That's something you need to do before the interview begins as well, is make sure that's set up so that things can progress as smoothly as possible.
Yeah. And if you work with an interpreter for the first time, prep them.
Exactly.
so that they're able to know exactly like the content of the discussion.
And a little later we'll talk about what we mean when we talk about prepping the interpreter, and is the interpreter a good fit for your client.
Exactly. Okay. This is another great quote that I pulled from Jay Walder, who has to be my favorite person that's ever worked for the MTA, because he's the former chairman who put in the on-time arrival clocks, and I found this just to be oddly poetic and really appropriate to this situation. We all know the experience that we have, every one of us, of getting down to the subway and not knowing what's happening, literally looking longingly down to the tracks to see if we can see the white light.
Yep.
Consider how much more pleasant your commute is, and then how terrible it gets when the clock flashes like 27 minutes, right? Like how an awkward subway ride could maybe turn riotous, right? So imagine that even more so in the experience of sitting in an interview room with a stranger you're tearing your guts out for. Right. This is something that I took from Best Practices in Nursing. It's called Ate It. It's something that all nurses are sort of required to do or told to do when they come in and they see you and you're in a hospital bed. You're supposed to acknowledge the person, introduce yourself, let them know about the duration of whatever the procedure you'll be doing, an explanation as to why that procedure is being done, and then thank them as you leave. So you acknowledge, hello, person who is sitting here. My name is Jasenia. I will be your phlebotomist. It will take about 20 minutes for me to phlebotomy your phlebotoms. I'm doing this because we need to ensure that everything is working appropriately in that system. And thank you very much for your time and your patience, right? Very, very similar can work in all of the interviews. Hello, how are you doing? Is everything okay? Like making sure that you're acknowledging all the persons in the room, the parents of the children that you may be interviewing. Introduce yourself and your role in the situation, particularly like how long it's going to take. I have the room for about an hour. We can go longer if we need to, or you could stop at any time. And we're doing all of this because we need to try and get as much detail as we can in order to make sure that when you interview for the asylum claim that they believe you. That's the whole purpose of why I'm asking you these questions.
Right. And then as part of that explanation, right, we're also saying what the next steps are going to be,
Exactly.
right? We're making a plan for that person after he or she leaves our office and sort of giving that big picture idea of what's going on. The young people that I used to work with when I worked with Safe Passage were often in special immigrant juvenile status cases, things that are complicated for adults. In fact, of the thousands of people I've trained, like nobody gets SIDGE on the first time. It's relatively difficult to understand that procedural history. So why are we expecting the 8-year-old to understand it if you only explain it once, right? No, that's not okay. To continue to explain to the client what the next steps are going to be, where in the process we are, what's the big picture goal, all of that. And don't just do it once, right? It's a good idea to get into that rhythm at every meeting. And just to back up on something that Jeff said, the idea if we're working with children often don't travel alone, right? They come with a big person. That big person, that adult, is sometimes a parent, a guardian, or proposed guardian, someone like that. They'll walk in together as a unit, and it's really awkward when you just grab the kid and go into an interview, right? Might be a good idea to sort of explain to everybody what's going on, and also explain that you as the attorney are going to meet one-on-one with this young person who's their client, and then at the end, we're going to all get back together so we can explain what the next steps are, right? Instead of leaving the adult person who came with the kid out in the cold and then relying on that 8-year-old to then explain what happened in the past hour or 2 hours to that parent about what's going on, right? It makes for an awkward situation for that kid as well. So the idea that you start together, you then separate, you then come back together might be a good idea for your practice. Okay, great.
All right. Other good reminders. One of my favorite things about being a lawyer is the magical umbrella we have of privilege and confidentiality. It's just such an amazing thing that we're able to, we have a seal stronger than the confessional seal legally. And I like to remind clients of that you know, in whatever way is most sort of a culturally appropriate for them to get that, like, this is a solid non-snitching zone, right? Like, you can tell me all manner of things, and I will not tell anyone else what you tell me. So often trauma is so inexorably tied with shame that there's an automatic hesitancy to reveal all of that information. So everything you can do to let them know that the secrets stay with you, and they'll only be shared with your colleagues who also will respect the bubble of confidentiality, can make things a lot more pleasant for someone. Something else I like to do is acknowledge the stupid questions that I'm going to ask. If you've grown up in the Northern Triangle.
So Jeff,
Yeah.
why didn't you go to the police?
Because that's a stupid question. Why would I
Exactly.
go to the police?
Why would you
Right,
go
like,
to the
right.
police, right? Everybody in my area where I grew up would know the answer to that. But this is
Exactly.
Jeff's perfect example of a stupid question, which would need to be explained.
Exactly, and you can add levity. You can let them know that you understand. You can say, I get why, you would not go to the police in the Northern Triangle. Like, why were they calling you those names, gentleman from Albania who is the victim of homophobic violence? Like you can let them know that you understand that that's a somewhat absurd question, but the purpose of asking it is so that they'll tell you in their words exactly what's happened, and you can prompt some of those great details around, oh, well, of course no one goes to the cops, but also the only police officer is like a 3-hour walk away.
Exactly, right? So another way to do this is also to explain, we're going to need to explain to the immigration officer, be that the judge or the asylum officer, why it is that you didn't call the police. So that's just another way of phrasing the question that Jeff was talking about.
Exactly. Another thing, and this is just also comes in with the affidavit writing, and just something to remember with follow-up questions and those greater detail questions. There's another Flannery O'Connor quote, is that all writing is absorbed through the 5 senses. Right? We recognize things as being credible, as being real, as being resonant because of how they sound, how they look, how they smell, how they taste, how they feel to us. So as often as you can, try and root the questions and the details that you're looking for in physical, immediate, definable experiences, right? I was afraid is quite vague. Like, how did their body react? What was the weather in the given situation where it happened? Like, all of these things, just go back again and again to like how you would describe it using just your 5 immediate senses.
Great. And then we have a note on translation here. So let's just take a pause and talk about working with interpreters and translators if that's something that's going to be necessary for your clients. And oftentimes it is, right? So we want to make sure that the interpreter is a good fit for you and your client. So if you have a young girl who's a victim of sexual abuse, you are a female attorney, you have chosen an all-female staff to help this young person, it would make more sense to have a female interpreter work with that unit as well. The same thing for young men or whatever the particular situation is, right? To be aware of all those factors when we're working with the interpreter as well. If we're working with an interpreter who speaks a language from a particularly small population, maybe it's an indigenous population, maybe it's a country where only one ethnic group speaks that language, so quite frankly, everybody knows each other, and you're talking about a really stigmatized subject, such as perhaps an HIV diagnosis or something like incest, it's a good idea to check in with your client about who is the best interpreter for that person, right? If you're going to be talking about those sensitive topics, to make sure that your interpreter is a good fit. So it's not just as easy as being like, oh, that guy down the hall, he speaks Spanish, he can interpret for me, or my paralegal can always be there, right? Sometimes it might take a little bit, or it does take a little bit of forethought to make sure that that interpreter is a good fit. And of course, before we get to the asylum office, if that's where we're going, just like Jennifer said, we're going to practice with that interpreter and our client to make sure they can understand each other. There's nothing worse than realizing that it's a different dialect or that there's some issue going on where your client and the interpreter don't really sync, and that this is going to be a complete disaster of an asylum office interview because you didn't catch that ahead of time.
And then I try and keep things, and I'll talk about the plan for the day with the client and the interpreter, but I'll sort of say that, like, ideally I'm gonna ask you, interpreter, to interpret exactly what the client is saying, and we're gonna try and only speak in sort of 10 or 30-second clips so that I can get a pause, because when someone carries on for a minute, 2 minutes, and then the interpreter is trying to sort of summarize exactly what gets said? I feel like a 10 to 30 seconds is
Right.
like a good.
That ideally the interpreter should assume the use of the first person. The interpreter becomes that person's, your client's voice, right? So it is, I did this, I did that. Not a summary, she said that she went up the mountain, right? I went up the mountain. The idea that it's these short clips, no one's memory works to be able, maybe the professional simultaneous interpreters, but in general, right, no one's memory works that well to be able to understand or to remember every single word. So we're doing short clips, we're using the first person, and we're checking in again with our interpreter before the interview, making sure that interpreter's a good fit, and also talking with our interpreter to make sure that that interpreter, especially a new interpreter, understands that we want him or her to translate every single word. No matter if it's offensive, no matter if it's a curse word or anything like that, we want to know exactly what our client said in his or her own words. It's important for us to lawyers to be able to have this unfiltered version of the story.
Cool. All right, doing the thing.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Great.
So I always like to start with very, very easy to answer questions. So sort of initial interview, I'll confirm biographical data, double check the spelling on something, right? It's very difficult right after, hey, how you doing, to going into, hey, can you tell me about the horrible things that your father did? So to try and build up not only time for this person to get comfortable with you, but maybe even occasional moments for jokes and small talk. Just confirm. Also, every once in a while there's misspellings. Every once in a while there's A number errors, or there's or people have moved, or birthday errors, things like that. I'll just go over for 10, 15 minutes, just all of the biographical minutia, and see if I can use that as a springboard for small talk. For later interviews when they've come back, because you can't use that card, you already played it in the first one. I try and confirm details from the story that we've already said. So confirm time, confirm dates, as well as you can. I always, start with start with the season if they can't remember the exact date, and then that help that narrow down to the month. Also, weather is just always such a great detail to put into anyone's story or anyone's narrative. Not only does it add like an incredible indicator of credibility, but it can help the client kind of go back into that memory space and kind of remember where exactly they were. So when you're picking up on some of those, other details might shake loose because they remember that it was really overcast.
Right. So we'll do sort of an example of the idea of something that I call normalcy, which comes from an anthropological background. Right. So just to preface this, we're going to talk about a particularly difficult population to work with, that of the teenage boy. It doesn't matter what culture they're from, it doesn't matter what language they speak. Teenage boys have this universal issue of answering everything with a shoulder shrug, fine, or some other kind of grunt-like answer. Am I right, Jeff?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean,
there are exceptions, right? If you're an exception, good for you, you rock.
It is the population that has historically fought pretty much all of the wars that we've had ever. So yeah, they're not, there's things going on there with their brains.
Excellent. So we've got a teenage boy as a client. We're trying to talk to him, and we're asking him, so you're going to be my teenage boy.
Okay.
So, so Jeff, how's everything in El Salvador?
Bad, fine, I don't know.
Okay, so like at home, how are things?
Fine.
Okay, so this is not going anywhere, right? I could do this for a while. This is the answer I'm going to get.
Yeah.
Fine, right? Something like that. Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
So perhaps I'll try a different strategy, right? And I'll say, okay, this is Jeff, my teenage boy. So Jeff, can you tell me about your daily life? What did you do when you woke up in the morning?
Well, first I would wake my brother up and get him dressed. Then I would start cooking in the house, and then my mom would wake up, and then we'd do morning chores. Sometimes we'd go to school, sometimes we couldn't. If we couldn't, we would maybe watch TV or...
Okay, cool. So he talked, right? It was more than fine, we had. And we have a lot of material that Jeff had presented for us to ask follow-up questions on. We asked him an open-ended question so that he couldn't respond with fine, something like that, right? We learned about he couldn't go to school. We want to know why, right? What kind of food was he eating? Was he eating every day? What did the house look like? Was there running water, right? There's a lot more questions that we can ask Jeff from that, maybe, 30 seconds that he talked, that could lead us to have a more meaningful conversation than how's everything. right? And so it goes into the idea of normalcy, where if you're 10, 15, or even an adult, and your whole life has been spent in a particular culture or a series of cultures, what you've experienced becomes normal to you. So if your culture, if bad things are happening, right? If when this young man, if Jeff, El Salvadorian Jeff is going to school, right, he's stepping over dead bodies, or he's seeing the drugs, the gangs dealing drugs, or they're recruiting his friends and people are murdered and his cousins are shot, and that happens repeatedly, day after day, that becomes normal to him. So when I asked Jeff, how's everything? It's fine, it's normal, right? Because that's what has become normal to him. But if we're explaining this to the asylum office or in a court of law, right, we want to take it out of that realm of normalcy and explain how Jeff's situation is different from other young people. Okay.
Yeah, we pretty much covered that. Yeah, food tells you so much. Asking people about what they ate and like how they ate it and who prepared it and where it came from can just lead to amazing fractal patterns of all manner of questions and amazing details.
Great. So we're getting now to the traumatic episode.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah. So I like to start the story about 6 hours before it happened. Like if there is one specific incident, I like to ask them to tell me about the beginnings of that day. Not only because I think it's a lot more comfortable for the client to be able to sort of get up to the sort of the major incident, but it also really starts to paint the picture and brings out a lot more of those details. It also, in writing the affidavit, really helps the reader get situated in the world where this thing is happening. It's a tough thing, but something with this kind of work, you have to get very comfortable with uncomfortable silences. Sometimes when you feel the urge to speak when someone's stammering, like literally give yourself a 10 count in your head and just wait and see if they're gonna just take a moment and focus and then bring it through before you start asking an immediate follow-up question or presuming and kind of like giving like a lead to them to help them to what you think is helping jog them, but might be making them shut down a little bit. I also like to ask what happened after the incident, not only to bring the client sort of out of that traumatic space, because they did in fact survive no matter what it was. They managed to get here into your office talking to you. But especially, we talked about this at another training around how to use literary techniques in affidavit writing. Particularly with like really graphic sexual abuse or other situations like that, it's oftentimes not necessary for you to get like real Law and Order SVU with it. Like you can get clinical and just sort of talk about the incident itself, but you can add a tremendous layer of important narrative with how did that person get home? How did they get away from that situation? And it also shows credibility, because they know, like they know if they had to run out with no shoes on. They know which neighbor's house they went to, right? We'll get into this more in the next coming slides, but adrenaline affects different people different ways. There's some sort of large silos about the general effects that adrenaline has on people, but everyone's response to reliving a traumatic incident shows up differently. Some people will laugh nervously. Some people will wind up making really funny jokes midway through as a way to calm themselves. Some people will cry. Some people will just really look like they just shut down. And look like they're just reading off of a teleprompter badly. But it's not because it's not real to them, but that's what their body is doing in order to protect them. Also, when someone discloses, immediately afterwards, thank them for the disclosure and acknowledge that it was a really hard thing for them to have to say it. Again, the way that guilt and shame are so wound up in trauma, people often feel terrible telling you about the terrible things that happen, even if your whole job is to hear them. And in order to not have the chilling effect of someone being worried that they're offending, hurting, burdening the person that they're telling to, it's sort of your job to be really forthcoming that, no, thank you for telling me, thank you for disclosing. I know that was really difficult.
So two things, just before I turn it over to you to talk about the trauma response, is the idea of your reaction to the traumatic event, to someone disclosing something that is that's a lot, right? And the idea of trying to mitigate your extreme reaction. And that's exactly what Jeff said, right? You are most likely one of the first people that this young person or whoever you're working with has told this to, and your extreme reaction can make that person feel worse, right? The idea of you are this lawyer. In a lot of cultures, right, lawyers are held to, quite an esteem. So I am working with you. Maybe you're doing my case for free, and now I've upset you. That's a lot of guilt that that young person or that person in general doesn't need to have. I'm not saying that you should have some stone cold hard face, right, when this person is disclosing details to you, but the idea of not having an extreme reaction can do a lot in terms of helping that young person to want to disclose more. And one more thing is we got a question from the audience a little while ago on what can someone who's a non-lawyer do to help someone going through the asylum seeking process. And I saved it for here because I decided that, whatever, as a moderator, I could do that. But I decided that this was hopefully a good place where we could answer that. And the idea is to believe the person. One of the saddest things I've ever seen in my practice is when my colleagues stopped believing our clients, right? When it was everybody was lying. And yes, that does happen. I'm not saying it won't. Or the idea that no one is credible, all of that. No, if someone's disclosing something to you, to be there, to be present at that moment, to believe what that person is saying, right? You can unpack it later, you can work over the details later, but to be present for that person really says a lot. And that is something that you don't need a law degree to do, because quite frankly, no one teaches you how to do that in law school anyway, which is hopefully changing. So with that said, I'm going to move it on, and Jeff and I are going to talk a little bit about the idea of mitigating, what is this adrenaline response, and mitigating that. Oh, great, we have questions. Okay, actually, I'm going to pause real quick, Jeff. Thank you, Professor Benson. Is it better to express sympathy or to remain impassive in sympathy versus empathy? So I'll start and then I'll hand it over. Sure. Is that cool? Right? What we don't want to do is be judgmental or to say that we understand. Because we don't get it, right? No matter who we are, no matter what we've been through, we weren't that person at that particular time and place in that particular situation, so we don't know what that person's been through. But we can be empathetic, right? And we can do our best to be able to be a space for that person to talk and to hopefully help that person to address what's going on. There's a great video that we don't have time to show today, but it's a quick clip on sympathy versus empathy and sort of what those mean by Brene Brown.
Yep.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It's on YouTube. Just Google it, Brene Brown empathy, and it will come up this little animated clip that I think is very useful to show. Jeff?
Yeah, I actually wanted to kind of go back because it occurred to me something that I really want to discuss, which is the notion of lying in this sort of like trauma-informed lawyering context. Like, because we're all trained as attorneys, right? It's like the elements of fraud is like, you know, intentional misrepresentation of a material fact kind of thing. That's, I think, not terribly useful when we think about the way people protect themselves in traumatized situations or when they've been through an awful lot of trauma, and the gradient of disclosure that you trust people with that kind of information, right? So if someone's dealt with family abuse for an incredibly long time, like they've learned how to be a good liar, right? Like if someone is LGBTQ in the world, they've probably had to learn how to be a good liar because the truth will get them killed. And so that's not a skill and a survival skill that you necessarily turn off just because this person told you that it was a safe space. I mean, it says safe space on the wall. How could you not be a safe space, right? So I've found that just in my practice is that a lot of times people aren't lying, they're withholding information either because they have a difficult time coming to grips with it and coming to grips with the severity of it, or they just don't trust you yet. And it's not on them to be proactive in the trust. It's on us to endear that level of trust. So when I've found inconsistencies before, like I try and not go to the immediate reaction of like, why are you messing up the case? What are you doing? Why are you ruining my work? Yeah, right? Like, why are you making me, misrepresent myself to the court? Like, consider for a moment all of the reasons why someone would have to not tell you the truth and try and address those reasons to get at the real answers.
Great.
Right.
So when we're talking about this adrenaline response, let's sort of talk a little bit about what happens when someone experiences trauma. Yeah. So your senses go into this danger mode, your brain goes into this emergency mode, your brain is effectively hijacked. A stress response is triggered and there's chemical and neurobiological factors that go into play. We're lawyers, we're not medical professionals, right? We don't need to know the fancy words. If you want to, we'll put them up in the Dropbox. But in general, there's changes in your brain structure that lead to different reactions. And like what Jeff said before, everyone's reaction is different. There's no one reaction that's right. There's no one reaction that's wrong. There's no universal indicators or responses to traumatic events. So as Jeff's going to talk to you about mitigating this, here's just some examples that I'll give of what some of these indicators could be. But again, this isn't a comprehensive list because there are no universal factors. Could be physical changes, freeze or immobility response, the idea of disassociation, behavior that we might find to be counterintuitive, impact on recall. And for us as lawyers, especially working in the asylum context, right, we have this idea of that could impact credibility, right? Our client can't remember. They have a difficult time forming a narrative. It is fragmented, it is nonlinear, it is confused, it is inconsistent. Perhaps they're unemotional, perhaps there's this flat affect, they're monotone. All of that can be responses to trauma. Difficulty processing information, loss of memory for key events, inconsistency at statements and times and dates, no memory of peripheral details, and then again, the impact on their demeanor. So, Jeff.
So some ways to help mitigate that as you develop a relationship with this person. So the kind of like three main silos that people's adrenaline responses tend to fall into is fight, flight, or freeze. Right, like on a very basic reptilian brain level, right? You're confronted with a threat, you either push up against that threat, you either figure out how to get the hell away from that threat, or you just lock up and your system's not able to work. So this is designed by a colleague of mine, Caroline Harvey, the co-founder of the trauma drunk phrase. So like helping people move around and like allowing people space to move around sometimes is really, really effective if they're a person that gets like very adversarial and really intense. Also good to remember that some people do get very adversarial and intense, and it's not you. You're eliciting that reaction, but you're not the focus of that reaction. The center one is flight. Oftentimes just letting people like, okay, we're gonna take a pause, and all we're doing, and we're just gonna take 5 deep breaths. And then we're going to continue, or we're going to decide whether or not we're going to continue, and just leave space within that during the interview. Also, like checking in with people, like warm water is really good, or allowing people to like get up and move around if they really start disassociative and going really cold and really kind of glazing over. I'm pretty sure this is up in the Dropbox as well.
Yeah, great.
And if you Google Caroline Harvey, she teaches at Berklee College of Music and does all kinds of amazing work around writing and trauma and somatic therapy and a lot of great stuff.
Super. So what we're doing here is we need to adjust our client relationship, right? Many of us might have trauma-informed practices. Some of us are new to this, and that's okay. It's never too late to start. So in terms of us as lawyers, we're allowing extra time for our interviews, right? We're not going to get everything out in one great 8-hour session. This isn't going to happen. You need to be realistic. These could be shorter interviews, right? We're always offering to pause, to come back to things later. We're not just trying to sit down in one shot and get all this out of our clients if we can work in another way. Importantly, we're suspending our judgment. We live in a society that judge. I'm sure I'm guilty of judging, and I'm sure a lot of us are, right? We need to believe, we need to empower, and we need to validate the survivor of whatever he or she went through. Appropriate counseling or referral services. And I'm talking about a targeted referral, right? The idea of, wow, that's really bad, you should seek help, that doesn't actually help anybody, right? That really just makes the person feel bad about themselves. But the idea of before the person comes in, right? Of having in your practice the idea of who are people that would be linguistically and culturally appropriate that I could refer this person to, this client coming in, that would be good to start building in your practice. The idea of working cooperatively, the idea of co-investigating, reducing this dynamic of power over, which is so important in the sexual abuse and domestic violence, and quite frankly, in any kind of trauma relationship here, is the idea that you're working with your client to be able to establish his or her case. And perhaps there's alternative ways for your client to tell the story. Without, sitting in your office and telling you face-to-face the horrible events that happened. I was working with a young girl from Mali who really just couldn't tell me in her own words about what had happened, but something really horrible had happened, and she would just sit in my office and cry. So this went on for quite a while, and we needed to do something, right? We needed to somehow work around that. So I bought her a little journal and some pencils, and she started writing. And at first it was just what she did, but then within her writings, it would come out about what happened. And we were able to get piece by piece her story that way. That's one technique. Drawing's another technique. Telling the story to someone else, talking to the wall, right? Maybe an issue is for that person to look you in the eyes, right, and tell that story. Perhaps that person's talking to the wall instead while you're merely listening in the room. So it's being creative in your strategies for being able to work with your client and tell those stories. So the idea, you're acknowledging, you're validating the feelings, you're explaining this need for these intrusive questions that Jeff talked about before. You're telling your client why the hell you're asking them about all these horrible things that happen. Why is this important, right? And what is the ultimate outcome? Developing this cooperative plan, taking breaks, frequent breaks, and the idea, again, so important, of asking open-ended questions. No matter who your client is, right? That's always something that we strive to do. Yeah. Should we go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay.
So aftercare, right? So what this person is disclosed, you've got a lot of great details. So what happens next? So always ask them where they're going for the rest of their day.
Yeah.
Right? It seems like such a simple thing to go over, but it's important that they also say it out loud, right? That they also like, no, I'm going to walk out of here and then I'm going to go do this, that, and the other thing, right? And then I'm going to go have lunch, yada, yada. You can also do some client counseling there, like, no, you know what, if possible, maybe you shouldn't do this thing that might be really stressful. Can you move that to another day? Let them know when you'll see them again and make sure that you've scheduled that, obviously also to make the appointments show up on time. But to give the client some sense of when this process will continue. And then, of course, what's happening in the meantime, right? Like, so what are you doing as the attorney? What do they need to be working on? And this is just a great way to kind of like close out and wrap up this very emotional interview session. I also try and leave all of my photocopying to the very end, just because it allows for like a little bit of a time of the small talk and lets them cool down a little bit in the room, sometimes without me there. Right? Like you take 5 minutes to copy whatever initial documents, and then they can kind of like compose themselves before having to go sit on a bus. Right?
The idea is that you've opened up this trauma box. You need to close the trauma box, right? There's no sending people off into the world with all of this trauma, craziness all out there without coming to some kind of closure for that day's meeting. When all of that's out there, right, it leads to additional stress, additional aggravating factors that could impact that person. So I would suggest to you to close the trauma box, right, at the end of your meetings. So some suggestions of things of what not to do, right? Judging, blaming, confronting. The whole idea of trauma is very interlinked to the idea of shame. So all of those kinds of judging, blaming, confronting are things that don't lead to good results when we're working with a traumatized population. Telling people to calm down, Jeff, right? Or relax, just relax. Everything is gonna be fine, just relax, right? It might not be okay, right? We all know that. And telling people to relax really, quite frankly, doesn't get them to relax. It usually just pisses them off. So those would be examples of perhaps things not to do as well. Minimizing, right? So the client's disclosing something and you're saying, I know exactly what you're going through, and then saying something else that would actually minimize that person's harm. Please don't do that. Touching without consent, right? Not everybody likes to be hugged or touched. Make sure you have your client's consent before you give them a big bear hug. That, for a lot of people, is a very uncomfortable experience, right? For just certain people. Also, there's cultural issues, right? There's a lot of issues that go into the hugging thing. Asking unnecessary questions and assuming the role of the therapist, right? So we are lawyers, we are counselors at law, not counselors at your mental health problems. Please don't assume the latter unless you are licensed, and then you can figure out your ethical boundaries and do as you like. That's outside the scope of this CLE, right? But your idea is not to also be their therapist or to try to offer your wonderful therapy that you got from your marriage counseling, so now it's gonna work for this person. No, right? That would not ultimately be appropriate in most cases for that client. It's not your role there. Your role there would be a targeted referral. It'd be to making sure that your referral to that therapist happens, that the client can go see him or her, and that hopefully that's a relationship where the client can begin to explore those issues that are impacting their mental health. Great. And I think we got some audience questions. Great. So we got some audience questions. If there's more, please feel free to bring them up. Oh, Lenny's coming with more. Okay, so I'm going to read this out loud and then we can answer it. When a client has experienced many instances of trauma, such as domestic violence, how do you decide which ones to focus on? Is it necessary to walk through each item in, I'm sorry, I can't read this. Each incident. Okay. Okay. So I know Lenny had looked at this before and had asked the question, or sort of, what are you trying to establish? Ultimately, what's the goal here? Is this past persecution, well-founded fear of future persecution, and also explaining why the client can't testify in a clear narrative. Any other?
Or like I would imagine like a VAWA case, like if you're doing a case under the Violence Against Women Act, you have to lay out what happened.
For me, when working in a detention facility, volunteering there, when it was short and we had to do this quickly, and there wasn't the idea of, you could sit with a person for 8 hours, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, but trying to unpack their story, you'd only see a person once and try to help them pass a credible or reasonable fear interview. It was first, worst, last. When did it start? What's the worst thing he ever did to you? And what was the last thing that happened before you left for the United States? So that would be in a domestic or intimate partner violence context. No matter what story you're telling the asylum officer, those 3 things should be there as well, right? Plus other items that happened as well, if that's appropriate to your case.
I've found a similar thing, like, first, worst, last, and that winds up, through the course of the discussion, bringing up a lot of others that came up in between.
And Jennifer Barker and I were also working on this one. That may be sufficient, but it could be that the reason you do have to take the time to explain the various incidences is you're laying a context. Sure. So perhaps you're showing that it was the reason your client cannot return to that place was these small incidences added up to a big one, or their fear is well-founded based on it. So really, to answer the question, you hate to not give details because you want to make your client's case as strong as possible, but really think, what is the purpose of my asking this question?
Yeah.
All right.
How do you sensitively deal with inconsistent accounts that ultimately will hurt credibility? Yeah.
I think a lot of it's in the attitude, like asking about the inconsistency in a way that doesn't that doesn't telegraph you not believing them.
So
right?
Did I understand you correctly?
Right, so wait, I'm sorry, I might be mixing it up. So this happened, then this happened, or this happened and then this happened.
Right, we're not cross-examining our client like Law and Order style, right? That would be hopefully not a good idea, something to do here. Can you help me explain? Right, sort of words like that aren't necessarily accusatory, as Jeff said, might be a way to help get around that inconsistency.
Yeah. And oftentimes it may be something as simple as what do they call it, script, as your error, right? Yeah. Like you may have conflated a couple of instances, which happens a lot, especially when you're dealing with a translator. Like it can be like things can go astray very, very easily.
Exactly, and so that's a perfect segue to the last point that I wanted to make, and this is Professor Benson's point, is in terms of working with interpreters, the movie Well-Founded Fear, which is excellent, and it's a documentary, it's from 1997, and it gives you a view of the asylum office, and you will see, interestingly, that some of the asylum officers that are featured in Well-Founded Fear still practice today, yay! So, yep, you'll see them, but it talks to you, or it shows you, actually, the different roles of the officers, and it has this great segment on, quite frankly, the failure of interpretation, right? We just see the ultimate horror of all horrors happen in terms of interpretation fail at the asylum office. If you haven't seen it, it would be a good thing to do. It used to be on PBS Point of View, but now it's on Vimeo. So you could get it there. If you don't know what Vimeo is, come ask us after that. It's free, Google it. But that's actually a great thing to check out as well. And I think with that, it is 9 o'clock. So we are out of time.